Come, let us fix our eyes on Jesus. This is Unpopular Theology, episode 62. Today, I'm going to be talking about the law. Before we get started, go ahead and hit the like button. Go ahead and subscribe. Go over to our Facebook page, like us over there. And we're going to be posting new content at the end of every month and the beginning of every month. And this will start tomorrow. The end of every month, we're going to have, along with our videos on Fridays, we'll always post those to Facebook. Starting tomorrow, we will have once a month what I'm calling the Unpopular Bulletin, where I will round up the news surrounding the church from the past month. So that's something to look forward to. So if you don't like us over on Facebook yet, go over and do that. And then the beginning of every month, I will have the schedule for the episodes in the upcoming month. And yeah, with that being said, nothing really personal to report. So let's dive in. Keeping law and gospel straight. This is Unpopular Theology. So while we're in this series of the means of grace, we're actually going to deal with something that's not actually a means of grace. And it's not a means of grace because it simply does not offer grace. What I'm talking about is the law of God. So the law of God is simply put all the commands and all the threats that God tells us through His Word, the Bible. So this is epitomized in the Ten Commandments. And if you see something where it says, if you do not do this, then this will happen to you, that's the law. Or because you have not done this has happened to you or will happen to you, that's the law. Lutherans historically divide the law into three parts. We have the law is a curb. Not parts, functions, excuse me. The law is a curb. So it stops blatant outbursts of evil. Doesn't always do that. Just as there are times when a car can jump a curb and hit, say, a tree or something worse, so it happens with the law. So it prevents complete and total chaos, but it doesn't stop everything. Perfect example of this is the idea that we have security cameras all over the place, and that you generally know you're on camera. Like, not to mess around because you have the first use of the law of the camera pointed at you. Well, hopefully you know in your conscience not to do this too. But another thing that stops people is if the camera pointed at you, you cannot, and so you have fear of getting caught. That is part of the first use of the law. Then there is the second use of the law. That is the mirror. So the law shows us our sins. It's a person looking at the Ten Commandments, you shall have no other gods, etc. May look at them and say, okay, I've kept them. But if you look at what Christ says, specifically in the Sermon on the Mount, when it comes to the law, He doesn't add new laws, but He explains the law in such a way that if you go by what He says, you cannot keep the law. And so the honest person has to look at the Ten Commandments and realize, no, I haven't kept the law. And so the law shows us our sins, and that's where the law ends right there. It does nothing to justify you. It does not even show you Christ. It just says, you have sinned, you deserve death in hell. Then there is the third use of the law, and that is a guide. Now, the first two uses of the law apply to both Christians and non-Christians alike. The third use of the law only applies to Christians. Third use of the law is it shows us how to live now that we have been saved. So just as there are the Ten Commandments, and they keep us from blatant outbursts of evil, so we live by the Ten Commandments. Perfect example of this is Luther. I think it was Luther who argued that every single one of the Ten Commandments has a negative aspect and a positive aspect. So, example, first commandment, you shall have no other gods. The negative aspect is don't go around worshiping other gods. The positive aspect is, as Luther put in his small catechism, we should fear, love, and trust in God above all things. That's the positive aspect. Second commandment, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Luther's explanation, what does this mean? We should fear and love God so that we do not curse, swear, use satanic arts, lie, or deceive by his name. So that's the negative aspect. And the positive, but we call upon him in every trouble, prayer, praise, and give thanks. That is the positive aspect. So you get what I'm saying here. It tells us what not to do, but it also tells us what to do as Christians. And again, I heavily emphasize that the law cannot justify us. The other major thing is that the law is almost always in the imperative. The gospel is never in the imperative. We'll get to the gospel next week. But this week, I'll be honest, it's doom and gloom. We're going to be talking about the law. We're still talking about the law. We won't really touch on the gospel much. So the gospel is never in the imperative. So there are pastors today, especially in megachurches, especially in non-denominational Baptist type. And this is not a rule for every single one. These are just what I've seen in my experience, what I've heard, where they'll sit there and they'll preach the law, what I like to call preach the law with a smile on their face. And they won't say what the gospel is. So they'll preach the law, all you gotta do to have your best life now. Technically, I can't say who that is because of his copyright, because he thinks he's above copyright, but let's just say he lives in Texas, Houston area. Here's the 5 ways to have your best life now. Yeah, those are laws, not the gospel. They are not, and they're man-made laws, not the gospel. And so they're not even really the true law of God. Then you'll get the people in the Arminian camp who will sit there and they'll tell you of the great news that Christ has given you the opportunity to accept him into your heart. That is not the gospel, because it's telling you that you have to do something for Christ to become to you. No, not even that. You have to go to Christ in their view. So that's the law, and again, that's a pretty terrible man-made law. So then there's some in the Calvinist group, not all, but there are quite a few what I would call hyper-Calvinists who will sit there and say that because in Calvinism there are those who are elect and those who are not elect. God chose both groups before the foundation of the world, who would be elect and who would not be, according to their view. They would sit there and say, oh, you're struggling with assurance of salvation? Well, I believe it's Paul Washer who says this. Correct me if I'm wrong. And granted, yes, I know Paul Washer is a Calvinistic Baptist. I'm aware of that. But this is an example of what some who call themselves Calvinists, and so I'll say they are. I don't want to go into too much detail there. They'll say, okay, well, check your works. Are you doing the fruit of the Spirit? Are you loving people? Do you have joy? Do you have peace? And that's a law too, because again, the fruit of the Spirit is the third use of the law. It's what we as Christians do as Christians. So those are examples there of how the law, people try to confuse the law and the gospel. Oh, I forgot one more. It's a movement that started in the 60s, I want to say, called the social gospel. It is the left-wing Christianity, and basically, today I'd even argue that it's in bounds of Christianity with some of the things it teaches. Basically, it argues that we got to work for a utopia on earth, if you will, sort of a socialist utopia, and and so one of the main arguments is that the goal of Christianity isn't to save people, but it's to make them more comfortable. That's not the gospel. Yes, Christ does tell us to feed the poor, do good to our neighbors, etc. And yes, those are commands. But the thing is that the way they take it to the extent that they make that the entirety of Christianity. And so they call it the gospel, but it's not. It's the law. And so that has no way to justify this. So those are the main examples of how the law and gospel can get confused. In summary, I talked about what is the law, I talked about the three uses of the law, and some confusions. So that pretty much wraps it up for this week. Next week, it'll be a more bright, shining episode where I will talk about the gospel. So until then, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus.